Class, MASH. By a Nutty. Chapter 351, Fanatics. Thank you. MASH approached Luke and the paladin with a smile. He tried to make it genuine but failed. He only heard a little of Luke's conversation with the paladin. Luke was thanking her for something. He hoped that was a good thing. The paladin responded as she stood and bowed. It is an honor to work with you, regardless of the circumstances. I will inform the others and make preparations to move. She turned and walked away from Luke while continuing to ignore Mash's existence. Even with a helmet on, he felt like she had glared at him as she passed. Mash wondered what her god had told them about him. Her entire entourage clearly didn't like him. They all wore the same armor, and all of them were focused on him. Their weapons were always in hand, ready to strike in case anything happened. He wasn't particularly worried about them, but he watched Serena as she walked toward the others. Once she appeared out of earshot, Mash asked Luke. I'm guessing the gods hate me. And what is she helping with? Mash didn't quite approach Luke before speaking. He wanted to trust Luke, but his friend was unstable. Mash couldn't recognize the look in his eyes and decided to stand a respectful distance apart. Mash glanced at the paladin as he mentioned her, but Luke's gaze never left him. Most gods do not hate you. Their followers likely will. You temporarily severed their connection with their god. Most will fear and hate you. To them, you are some kind of monster that can strip them of their purpose. Mash shuddered at Luke's explanation. He didn't actually care much about severing a god's chains, but the way Luke spoke bothered him. It was so different that it made his smile grow strained. Mash moved on quickly. Okay, what about Serena? What did she want? She will aid me for the foreseeable future. Luke didn't say anything more as if that was enough. Mash bit back a more annoyed response and just asked for clarification. In what? Mash was a little annoyed by the look of confusion that crossed Luke's face. What did expect with such an incomplete answer? Mash hadn't gained much knowledge when advancing, but Luke treated him and everyone like they should already know. In anything I ask. Their god is one who shares much with myself and they will follow my instructions so long as their god permits it. For now, that will be protecting the beastmen and helping me establish a temple. There was no doubt in Luke's words, and Mash decided to accept them at face value. It didn't really matter if the paladins stuck around. They weren't strong enough to threaten him or the others. Based on his estimations, only Serena was above level 150, and he doubted that she could do anything suspicious with him and Jill around. Between Jill, Luke, and himself, their group had quite the range of vision and insight skills. Someone with a class focused in deception might get past some of their skills, but that wasn't a concern with a paladin. Great, that sounds great. Well, let's get around to doing that. Jill said she could probably teleport there and then come back for the rest of us. Luke nodded. That was all he did, and Mash fumed internally at the awkward exchange. Ultimately they hadn't decided to part ways, but they would work more independently soon. Luke, for example, will remain with his people while the rest of them try and figure out how to kill a god. Red's family will probably come up soon, and Mash just needed to wait for the Empress of Colors to set up the meeting. They stood in silence for a moment longer, before Mash left to tell Jill that she could go. It didn't take long for her to go and come back. After making a few final preparations, Jill teleported them all there. After her recent advancement, she actually had enough mana to teleport all of them, including the paladins. It took a lot out of her, but she managed. The world shifted around Mash, and he stumbled when they arrived. His balance was fine, but his senses were overwhelmed as his domain suddenly flooded him with too much information. It had been far easier to adjust within his own world and skills. Another person moving him caused more problems. He dug his feet into the grass and dirt. It left an impression as his feet practically plunged into the ground. The gesture made the paladins draw their respective weapons. Most of them used swords except for one whose hands simply glowed. Lisa tapped his shoulder, and he felt a pulse of mana enter his body. It instantly eased his dizziness and helped him stabilize his body. What was that? And thanks. Mash nodded at her gratefully as his mind instantly cleared. I just helped you focus. You did the rest, or Priscilla. Her voice was soft and quiet as always, but it didn't feel as subdued as it had. He hoped that she would treat him more normally, and this was a good sign for that. Now that his mind was clear, he took in his surroundings. His domain let his eyes sneak into everything. He also realized that they weren't that far from the capital. Mash glanced around as he felt several different presences collide with his domain. Jill, we said not to go that close. They know we're here now. Mash shouted over to Jill. She rolled her eyes at him before responding. We are far out. Look, we can barely see the city's walls. We were going there anyways. Mash glared at her, as Red cut in. You are right, but now it seems like we are attacking. Either way, nothing will change with an argument. Let's just meet whoever comes and deal with it. Luke, do you have any idea on what to do now? Red turned toward Luke, who was already walking toward the city. They all stared at him for a moment, before following. For a second it seemed like Luke hadn't heard her, but then he responded slowly. Yes. I feel my people, they are calling to me even if they do not know it yet. The words sounded like they came from a different man, and Mash hated the sound of them. It sounded too arrogant. The kind of statement only a god could make. Despite the way the words made his skin crawl, he didn't doubt them. Plus, he wanted to help the beastmen too. They followed Luke as he led them around the city. Not toward the main entrance, but to a village on the side of the city. It was ironically placed to be in the city's shadow in the afternoon. Thus the city of the setting sun, as it was named, never showed its sunset to this village. Mash could see the people in the village and recognized the many animal ears and tails on the people. Beastmen, and a lot of them, were placed behind the city, hidden from the entrance and its namesake. It was a bad sign, but he also noticed that they weren't particularly hurt or angry. Most of the people in the city seemed fine. Children played, and parents worked mundane jobs. Few beastmen entered and exited the city along with the general mill of people. Mash was surprised. He expected worse of his people. The beastmen seem fine. It looks like they are well protected. Mash spoke for the others. They couldn't see what he did. Luke shook his head almost immediately. No, you are missing their classes. Look at their power and you will understand. There was no way Luke could see them from here, but Mash examined the people more carefully. He noticed it almost immediately. None of them are strong. Mash said the words carefully, watching Luke for some confirmation. Mash could feel their relative abilities, both physical and magical, and was making his judgment based on that. None of the people felt even remotely dangerous. Yes. They are restricted. I would bet the king has done something to those who possess powerful classes. Their classes are almost all civilian-related jobs. Luke's response confirmed Mash's guesses. It did make him wonder how the king was controlling or monitoring them, but he guessed there was a class for that. Skills had such variety that he would assume that there was a skill for everything. Mash considered the king and saw the man too. His domain had fully encompassed the city at this point. He was strong enough now to peer into the temples too, well, most of them. 2 temples remained hidden, and he guessed they had skills to block intrusion. One of them was the moon goddess, Elise. He wondered if she would be open to talking again. Last time, she had hinted about having knowledge on the world owner, and he was hoping to ask her more this time. Mash wasn't focusing on any individual in the city, but he knew where the king was. The man was speaking to General Urkish and preparing to meet him. Knights, and the army itself, was preparing for a fight. Mash hoped it wouldn't come to that. The general seemed to notice his gaze and glanced in his direction. She did not look pleased. The king on the other hand looked furious. His head darted back and forth as he gave commands out. Mash saw his own brother there, but Luna was still hidden. She was probably in the temple. Jill could have teleported them to the village. In fact, they could have run there in a few seconds if they wanted to. Red had suggested that they don't do either. Approaching a city in haste wouldn't seem like a peaceful action, and everyone was afraid of him at the moment. They were overreacting in his opinion. He wouldn't do anything crazy or destructive. At least, not without good reason. They gave the king ample time to respond, and eventually, he did. Oh, they're coming. Mash called out, and he turned toward Red, who nodded. She had expected this reaction and claimed that her family would likely be around too. Not anyone important, but someone would be there to observe what happened. He observed the king, the general, and his brothers approach. There was an escort of knights and the like too, but he didn't care as much for them. Although some of them were around level 150. It took him a second to comprehend what he saw. They're matching us. Our levels, I mean. Then they aren't looking for a fight. This is the general practice when engaging peacefully with another nation. Red explained the situation that he saw. I'm not that big. Mash meant it as a joke, but nobody seemed amused. Jill even disagreed with him. You're way bigger than that. Also, you literally changed the entire world already. Jill smiled as if she had intended to play along. In light of recent events, the joke turned out far more literal. Luke, Red, and even Lisa nodded to the statement like it was a fact. Their jokes were less ridiculous than reality at this point. That fact disturbed him a little, and it must have bothered the others too because an awkward silence hung over them after that. It was almost a relief to see the angry face of the king. Chapter 352, King and God. Mash considered how to best approach the angry king. He settled on waving at his brother. Arthur stood behind General Urkish to the left of the king. Arthur wore shining blue-silver metal armor. It looked like it should have had a helmet, but his brother's face was exposed. Mash got to see his brother smile for a moment though he didn't wave back. His brother's expression turned flat when Urkish glanced at him, but Mash hadn't missed the smile. The king wasn't smiling, nor were the people around him. Most of the ground outside of the city was empty, made intentionally bare for the sake of defense. He could see several guards milling about on the walls. Mash could tell that they were watching. The king's words filled the air between them. Why are you here, Mash? It was not a friendly greeting. The Empress of Colors had been much more amiable. The king didn't seem to share her opinion, nor did the people around him. The general's face stiffened, and the knights and guards squared their stances a little. Only Arthur remained unmoved by the king's words. Mash couldn't help it. He knew that he shouldn't do anything to worry the king or the knights, but he couldn't stop a smile. His sharpened teeth made the smile inhuman, but he only grinned wider at the way everyone tensed. It was the wrong thing to do, however, he realized now just where he stood. He had met other powerful people, but this was his king. Well, the king of the place he had called home. Both statements probably didn't apply anymore, but it didn't change the fact that this was the most important person in the kingdom by far, and now Mash stood on even ground with him. The king had seemed so powerful in the past, but that wasn't the case anymore. Mash could also tell that General Urkish was stronger than the king both in magical and physical abilities. Of course, the more unique skills were unknown, but he was fairly certain the general would win in a fight. The king saw it now too. Now, that is a monster's smile. Urkish spoke easily, much more casually than the king had. She didn't feel as tense either, but she was watching Mash like a hunter. Her response didn't make the smile vanish, he just responded grinning all the while. "Yeah, we are here to help the beastmen." Mash couldn't think of a clever response for Urkish, so he decided to just respond to the king. He couldn't think of any gentle way to broach the subject either, so he just put his intentions out there. The king's stiff face cracked, and his eyebrows rose dramatically. "You are the one who destroyed their city and ended the war. Now, you want to help them. They wouldn't accept that." The king didn't sound particularly angry, but his voice rose with disbelief. "They will accept my help though, and Mash is here to help me. To redeem himself if he can." Luke's words weren't magically carried through the air, but they were the clearest words ever spoken. Everyone who was watching turned to him as he spoke. Mash wasn't suppressing anyone's aura, domain, or whatever, so everyone's presence clashed with one another openly. Luke's aura seemed to draw attention to his words and actions. The king shook his head. "And how do you intend to help them?" Luke responded almost instantly, though they had agreed that Lisa or Red would be better at explaining things. That being said, Red looked oddly like a sick child, and any explanation from her would be weird. It meant that Lisa was supposed to be the one to talk here, but Luke wasn't giving her a chance. Honestly, Mash wasn't supposed to speak earlier either. Both Mash and Luke had become less polite since their advancements, whereas Lisa was pretty much permanently polite. "I will give them a haven. A place to grow and build free of others. Like the elven prophet and queen, I will provide the beastmen with sanctuary." The king had never been smiling, but Luke's words made his lips bend down. "No. Not again. What makes you think I would allow that? You do not own my people, nor will I take any of your lands. They will come to me freely or remain by their own choosing. However, you will not stop me from taking those who wish to follow." Mash's mouth hung open. Luke spoke with such confidence that even the king hesitated to respond. It only lasted for a second. The king shook his head. "No. There is nowhere you can take them. I have and will protect them." "You are not protecting anyone. You are domesticating them." Where are all those with power? I sense more than a few in your prisons. Free them. They have fought for a place in this world, and I will offer them one. Luke snapped back almost immediately, and Mash began to realize that Luke had more in mind than he had told them earlier. Mash wanted to ask something but refrained, sensing this wasn't the right place or time. Luke probably had something in mind, or the other person in his head did. You do not command me. The king roared back, his fury exploding in a blazing fire. Literally, flames spat from his mouth as he shouted back at Luke. The ground around the king burned as if he had become fire incarnate. Mash's skin dried up instantly, and the air he breathed in was hot. If it felt like that for him, it must be unbearable for everyone else. The knights must be getting cooked alive in their armor. Arthur was sweating and he wasn't even wearing a helmet. The general was the first to react, and she placed a hand on the king's shoulder. She pushed a little and the king's feet dug into the ground several inches. The fire coming from his mouth disappeared, but the hot air lingered. Urkish glanced at Arthur, who waved his hand to cool the air around them. The cold air of ice collided with the hot air and filled the space with an eerie mist. On the wall, people panicked as their line of sight thinned. The king didn't calm down, but the fire and heat had stopped. I am a king. You are not. You are not a leader of men. The king's words brought up a question Mash had considered several times now. The king class didn't actually grant someone a kingdom. Someone could get the class without being a ruler of any kind. He wanted to ask, but again this wasn't the time for him to interrupt. Luke's confidence didn't waver as he responded. I will not rule them, but neither will you. You are not their king anymore. All those in your prisons will be freed. Mash could do it with force if he wanted. Was that a threat? Mash thought that it was, and it was a threat in his name. He wanted to say something but didn't really know how to respond since he might actually do it. It wasn't part of their plan, but he didn't need a lot of incentive to free people. Mash is powerful, yes, but he is one. I do not fear him. He may have a record of killing monarchs, but the first lacked the levels to inherit a throne, and the second lacked his army. The King of Chains was arrogant and a fool. We are kings and our power comes from more than ourselves. The king stood next to General Urkish, his gaze was firm. Mash looked at the two and would bet the king had more people near that level ready to fight if needed. A fight wasn't their goal, and Red had enough silence. Let's not do rash. I really don't want to hurt anyone here, and I believe Luke has a good plan in mind which he will share with us now. If anyone else had said that it would have failed. However, none of the people here were heartless enough to overlook the pleas of a sickly little girl. Who are you? How did a child get such power? The general's question alerted everyone to the fact that Red was unrecognizable. Her face was similar, but everything about her had changed. In fact, they might have to stop calling her Red. It was no longer a nickname that suited her. I'm Elenia. A few eyebrows raised at that claim. The king stared at her for far too long before responding. Fine, I will at least listen to Luke's request, in hopes of stopping an altercation. Mash let out a short breath. Well, that was a good response. Now, Luke just had to say something reasonable. Luke nodded, and Mash's hopes rose. I will take them, all of them regardless of power or crime, to the Necromancer's Island. That is where my people will find salvation. Luke's plan was not something they knew about, and it was way crazier than what Mash had thought. Mash couldn't keep quiet any longer. It made absolutely no sense considering what he had done earlier. Seriously? I'm an unholy monster, but is the Necromancer safe? Are we going to kill them? Is that the plan? Mash stepped toward Luke with each question. Luke stared at Mash with his impassive golden eyes and answered him flatly. No, I know the Necromancer. They will provide protection and have the power to maintain it. Even the king would not risk attacking the island. Luke spoke with so much assurance, that Mash knew that it was the other Luke talking. Mash didn't know much about the Necromancer, but they were as infamous as him. And they had survived a lot longer too. An alliance with a famous villain, a person whose name was used to frighten children. It might be better to fight the king. Judging from the expression on Red's face, she was probably thinking the same thing. Chapter 353, The Connection. Luke met the eyes of everyone as he spoke. His friends had not known what his plans had been but trusted his judgment. However, he did not think that they would support him had he told them who he wanted to meet. It didn't matter though. All they had were stories and legends of the Necromancer. They knew nothing of who he was, but he knew. I know the necromancer. They will provide protection and they have the power to maintain it. Even the king would not risk attacking her island. He had lived through a part of her life, yet that alone wouldn't make him so certain. No, it was the memories of the god that told him to trust her, the necromancer, Valeria. He might be the only one alive who actually knew her name, the only one that didn't just refer to her by class. The previous god had known her, and now Luke did too. There was a promise he needed to uphold, even if he wasn't the one that made it. Confidence, and a strong desire, left him certain in his words. He met the eyes of everyone who might challenge him. The only ones he truly trusted at that moment were the paladins. Her. The question made him swing his head around. Lisa, of all people, had spoken. She had found a question before any of the others. Her eyes were wide but clear, and her question made him hesitate. Red caught on immediately and piled on to Lisa's question. The memories. She is in the memories you got. Is that why you think she will help? Luke nodded slowly, deciding that the full truth would be kept to himself. He couldn't help but think about Valeria though. Ever since he had considered the plan, a piece of him had grown excited. He had memories with her that were intimate, and he felt like he could trust her. Leah had haunted him. Now, Leah felt so small and inconsequential with everything that had happened. It felt like something that had happened ages ago. Valeria though was fresh, and he couldn't help but picture her. Her eyes were unblemished white as if they had been carved from bone. She was more beautiful than. Yes. This is not up for debate. He nodded his head abruptly, to disrupt the image as he responded. It was becoming more and more difficult to separate himself from the god. His mind was adapting by combining all of the memories into a single person. He couldn't help but wonder who he would be in the end. The answer came to him. A god. He would be a god. His face hardened as he met the angry faces of his friends. Jill didn't seem particularly bothered by the declaration, but he couldn't focus on her for too long. She was his enemy. A predator in a sense, but she was still just a baby. It was like staring into the mouth of a baby dragon. Once Jill grew up, she would hunt him. He knew that other gods would kill her. They would take one look at her and know. Luke's own mind had memories of doing it. Of killing people like her, people who took classes to oppose the gods. He wouldn't do it. He shifted toward Red and Luke, both of them looked frustrated. The king and his companions still seemed shocked. He glared at each and every person. Mash still wasn't suppressing his aura, so he let it flare out and meet the king's. They clashed and Luke could have sworn he saw the moment powers collide. The air between them seemed to glow for a moment. Luke felt some sweat run down the back of his neck, as he strained to match the king's aura. The king was more experienced and at a higher level. However, his aura was not as pure. The king's aura was created from his kingdom. Luke was born from a much grander ideal. He could match the king. The king's eyes widened a fraction before narrowing. Luke felt the king's aura grow hot. Luke felt more sweat build on his palms as if a fire were only inches from them. Another aura crashed down on their battle like a sudden storm. It was as if something had swallowed him whole. His aura crumpled and dissolved. He blinked and before he knew it his palms were on the ground. Grass poked through from between his fingers, as he recognized the overwhelming presence. He glanced up to see the king being half carried by Urkish. The general finally had a face to match her role. She finally saw Mash for the monster he was. Luke slowly turned to Mash and saw him. Felt his power. No, it wasn't a matter of power, but of nature. Mash's aura was meant to devour. The domain of the end was always meant to snuff out everything within. All Mash needed to do was let it. Even with all of his knowledge, Luke knew very little of Mash's class, but he understood a lot about abilities now. Things even Mash probably didn't realize or couldn't know. Luke wouldn't tell him, not when he could already do things like this. Luke watched as Mash walked between him and the king. Strolled through as if there had nearly been a fight a second ago. Luke empowered his body by forcing it to heal. It wouldn't free his aura, but it would repel any form of weakness. He rose to his feet slowly. The king wasn't so lucky. The man still managed to shake off the disorientation that came with losing an aura battle, although his stance was no longer so firm. The king had lost some of his confidence. Mash looked at the king, and then back at him before speaking. This is dumb. Just let Luke talk to them. I'll make sure that they know the truth. They'll know full well that Luke is working with me and the necromancer. And let him do the same with your prisoners, soldiers, whatever you want to call them. They will be completely free to make their choice. Mash's pupils glowed white, while the darkness of his eyes seemed to consume the light around them. Mash didn't look like a normal human in many ways, but his appearance now was nightmarish. The king was about to respond, but Mash talked over him. You don't want a fight? Not with me or Luke, and there is no reason to either. Are you really going to stop the beastmen from meeting their god? I doubt the other gods would like that. The king hesitated at that statement. The king and his people might be able to stop Mash and Luke, but he couldn't do it without the other gods' support. Luke didn't believe that they would fight Mash or him for a cause such as this. Luke smiled briefly but stopped when Mash turned on him. You need to explain the plan though. Tell us who the necromancer is, and why we should trust her. Luke's immediate reaction was to shake his head. It was his past, and he didn't need to share it. No, that was right. It wasn't his past, but the previous god's history. Something from hundreds if not thousands of years ago. Even if it wasn't his past, he didn't want to share it. What could he tell them? I will say that she has never entrapped any souls. The rest is not my story to tell. He was careful with his words now. Unlike before, he felt uncomfortable talking about the woman. He simultaneously knew her as two different things. The stories of the necromancer he heard as a kid were terrifying and wicked. The memories, he knew to be true, revealed a very different person. He could picture her clearly in his mind. In fact, he could remember the moment when she earned her name. Valeria P.O.V. Valeria stared over the railing of the ship she was on. She could see an island in the distance. It was little more than a tiny speck for now, but she couldn't help but smile. There lay her dreams and the hopes of her people. She wished the ship would speed up, but it wasn't designed for that. It was a plain wooden ship, that really seemed like it should sink. It was ironically named the Sea Queen's Throne even though it wasn't a fancy or elaborate vessel. What it was a large cumbersome boat that could only sail because of the skills of the captain and its crew. Every single crew member on board had some variant of the basic sailor class, and they all had the disbelieving sail skill. It was the kind of skill that a combat class couldn't get, and she was glad to see an entire crew with it. They were literally a dying breed of people, and part of the reason she took this voyage was to get away from everyone else. The humanoid races were growing more violent. Fewer and fewer people took non-combat classes. It seemed like even the system was reacting to the change. She had heard several rumors that even mundane worker classes were getting combat skills now. It bothered her and left a nasty taste in her mouth. The worst part of it all was that most of the gods and kings were fine with the change. Most people seemed to believe that power was all that mattered. They all acted so desperately for it, and for what? A threat thousands of years in the future? She couldn't be like them and ignore the present peace to try and prepare for some unknown danger. The world owner hadn't told them anything yet, so many were ready to believe. To change their nations and people on the words of another. Valerie couldn't do that, and neither could Luke. As she thought of him, her eyes drifted over to the center of the ship, where he stood on an elevated platform. His golden hair and fur reflected the sunlight and made his wolf-like ears glow along with the many markings across his body. They were like ley lines that ran across his limbs and made him glow like a torch. Hundreds of beastkin stood and listened as he told them what to expect and prepare for. He was their god, and they listened to his words as if they were laws. She smiled at him, and his head turned sharply to meet her eyes. He smiled back, a long fang slightly peeked over his bottom lip. It made her face flush slightly and she turned away. They had been together for over 100 years now, and she still felt a rush of heat whenever he smiled like that. People with high charisma really should be banned from smiling. At least not in front of a crowd. Several people, men and women, both gave her some obviously jealous looks. Jealous though some were, nobody looked at her with any real anger or hatred. No, most people treated her with the same reverence as Luke, even though she hadn't yet advanced to his stage. She was level 200 and could take the trial, but there was something she needed to do first. She knew her people and they were too peaceful for the world to come. The beastkin needed a place for themselves. A place to pursue whatever dreams they wanted. She would give them that place, and her people knew it. There were thousands upon this ship alone, and many smaller ships were also making their way. Enough people to make a nation. All that was left was an island known to be the home of a dragon. Luke believed the dragon was one of the good ones, but Valerie knew the stories. There would be a cost, one that she would pay happily if it meant safety for her people. She looked again toward the island. The sun was just above it. Her dream was so close. Chapter 354, Valeria PT1. Valeria was the first off the boat. She had been eyeing the beach for the past half hour and was excited to explore the island. The sand she could see was black like obsidian. She had foregone shoes during much of her journey across the sea and didn't bother wearing any now. That was a decision shared by many, and many regretted it almost immediately. Others who dared the beaches barefoot were yelping loudly. The sand was hot enough to even make her dance between her feet. Compared to the slightly chill water of the ocean and the deck of the ship, the sand on the beach was like active charcoal. She could easily tolerate the heat with her levels and stats, but it didn't take away from the surprise. A warm power passed over her, and the small pain in her feet vanished. She glanced back and saw Luke walking up to her. He was looking toward the inner parts of the island, and despite the smile on his face, she saw the tension in his eyes. The dragon had promised sanctuary, but it was hard to trust such a being. Something that had lived through generations of people and ignored for so long. Luke had done something to earn protection, and she trusted him. He had met with the dragon and had trusted the being. That said a lot considering what he could see. Should we go, now? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but Luke could both hear her and read her lips if needed. He nodded and spoke just as quietly back. Yes, but I feel uneasy. Warren claims that several other beings have been following us, and I can detect a handful of deities looking this way. His brow furrowed as he got close enough to avoid most people. She detected the hint of doubt in his voice. Do you think the dragon will dislike it? Torokan has agreed to aid us, and I would use his name here. He has treated us with respect and deserves the same in return. Luke's reprimand sounded eerily like her father's. It made her clench her fist in a very familiar and instinctive motion. Don't do that. I really don't want to think of my father when talking to you. She shuddered a little at the thought. Luke's forehead wrinkled and his lips pursed together tightly. Sorry, but you need to treat Torokan right. He will protect our people. Is that not enough to forgive his species? She nodded, but it was stiff. Dragons had a bad end, more importantly, dangerous history. They had killed her father, and even though she never really cared much for him, she still didn't like it. The idea that something could come down and just kill or destroy whatever they wanted to. Luke was right though. Plus, she shouldn't judge a species based on the actions of an individual. She still couldn't shake the image of. I will, but only once he earns it. Words are just that. Luke sighed but nodded. He was a stubborn person when it came to his ideals, but he usually conceded when it came to her. Fine, let us do just that. He is waiting to meet you as we speak. He waved a hand toward the inner part of the island. She couldn't really see far inside. Trees separated the rest of the island from the beach like a wall. The trees somehow felt lively with leaves that looked a bit too green, and bark that had the newness she would normally attribute to polished metal. Compared to the black sand, it was an odd sight. This would be a strange home, but one she hoped would last forever. Lead the way. She said the words a little playfully while holding her hand out for him to take. Luke smiled and took her hand gently, squeezing her fingers a little in the process. I would be honored to do so, my lady. He played up the formality, mimicking what they had heard among human nobles. It still made her face heat up, and she swatted at his shoulder lightly. Even with all of the stress and tension, or maybe because of it, they made sure to find the time to enjoy each other's presence. People had always said that power came with responsibility. But no one ever mentioned how disproportionate it was. There was just so much she needed to do. Even with Luke and half a dozen others at his level, she still couldn't see an end to her duties. Finding a home was the first step, and it was probably one of the easier steps too. After all, the next step would mean that she would need to meet with the leaders of the other races. That next step could wait until after she advanced. And another year on top of that. She needed a break, and hopefully, find the time to formally get married to Luke. Their engagement had already gone on for far too long, and she was annoyed by how many people thought that it was a sign their relationship was failing. She let Luke pull her toward the forest and away from those concerns. Luke turned their walk into a small tour of the island. He along with two others had explored the island and met with the dragon. She had been too low level to join them with a dragon in the mix. As such she marveled at the beauty of the place. Rivers cut through the island in many places. They stemmed from a mountain in the center in a way that reminded her of a spider web. The island was large though and had more than just forests. There were probably 3 distinct forests on the island. Each was separated by a grassland. With the way the rivers separated the island into parts, it almost felt like an intentional design. It took a little over an hour for them to walk from the beach to the mountain in the center. She gazed up at the mountain that was weirdly a shade of brown, at least the rock she could see was. A good portion of the mountain was covered by grass or moss. It seemed like a foreign object that had been lodged into the ground. Even with all that, the strangest thing she noticed was far smaller. About halfway up the mountain, she saw regular indentations on the side of the stone. They were oddly shaped half circles. Are those windows? She raised her left finger and pointed at them as she asked Luke the question. I'm not sure. They weren't here last time, Luke said, shrugging his shoulders and dragging her toward the mountain. She could see a cave opening, but her eyes were drawn to the old man standing outside of it. The man looked old and had a beard that ran all the way to his waist. He looked like a beastkin, one of her people, but she instantly knew what he was. The dragon had given himself a visage of ursine beastkin with rounded ears. His appearance wouldn't be that unusual, except for his body. His skin and hair were bronze and gleamed with the shine of new metal, and his body was shaped like a perfected man. Not an ounce of fat obstructed his muscles, and she realized after a second, that no cloth did either. The old bearded dragon was naked, and she couldn't help but look. The dragon had done a very good job in making his body. Luke's hand came up a moment later to block the sight from her vision. Torokin. Please, if you take a form like ours, you need clothing. Just think about what kind of impression you left on my lovely wife. Luke shouted the words, but she could tell there was no real anger behind it. He continued to pull her toward the dragon too. Clothing, of course. I had the feeling that I had done something wrong but couldn't figure out what. The dragon's voice was deep, and it felt like the mountain itself was talking to her. The ground even shook a little with each word. Luke lowered his hand, and she was a little relieved and disappointed to see the dragon in his clothes. Torokin had chosen to wear plain robes that seemed to be made of bronze, yet they swayed with the breeze like normal cloth. There was no fancy embroidery or anything, but she thought that single robe would be worth more than any king's wardrobe. Now that the dragon wasn't nude, she focused on his face. His hair was short and bronze like the rest of him. He had a few wrinkles around his eyes, which was the only real sign of age. His eyes stood out though. His eyes were not metallic like the rest of him. They were like small lanterns, and orange light moved within dark brown irises. It seemed like they were containing his real appearance within them. When she met that gaze, she felt like she got a glimpse of the real dragon for a second. Luke wanted her to be polite, so she treated the dragon like any other noble. Hello, I am Valeria, daughter of the dry grass. She bent her knees in a small curtsy and dipped her head a fraction. When she looked back up, she was a little disturbed to see Torokin mimic the motion. Hello, I am Torovelkinalonal, though you may just call me Torokin. I imagine it would be difficult to pronounce my true name. The dragon was right. Even after hearing the name spoken, she didn't think she could repeat it and decided not to try either. Torokin wasn't done speaking either and met her suspicious gaze with a warm, gentle gaze of his own. Young one, I thank you for trusting me. For chasing after a dream that I would. She saw it then. As Torokin spoke, his gaze softened into one she could recognize. The gaze of an old man watching a child chase after a foolish dream. Valeria was nearly a century old, and it had been a long time since someone last saw her as a child. She had advanced quickly, so she still looked somewhat young, but even with that in mind, she still appeared to be an adult easily into her late 20s or early 30s. To a dragon, she was a little better than a baby. Your mountain seems different from last time, Luke commented as he gazed deeper into the cave. She followed that stare and saw a very neat hallway. Crystals that emanated light lit up the dim passageway and highlighted what looked like stone doors. The doors were obviously sized to fit her people like Luke. Yes, as I understand, your people will need shelter while you build yourselves some proper homes. It was a tiny effort to fill the mountain with rooms. The dragon ran a hand through his beard while smiling at them happily. The gesture was worth a lot, but it also revealed how little the dragon understood of them. They had a dozen different skills to help make buildings, and there was plenty of material to work with on the island. It was still a kind gesture, so she forced a smile. Luke did not and began chuckling and laughing at the old dragon. She punched him in the side. Hard, since anything else wouldn't do anything. Chapter 355, Valeria PT2. Valeria's attitude toward the dragon changed upon meeting him. Torokin was even more friendly than Luke had claimed. He had gone out of his way to prepare for their arrival and had even altered the land in places for them. The dragon had a lot of control over the terrain here and he had adjusted portions of it for housing and farming. The dragon talked a lot about what the island was like, but she had already seen much of it. The island could only be described as lush. Forests, rivers, and grasslands covered nearly every inch of the island. The black beaches were the only places that weren't overfull with green life. The dragon had shaped some of the grasslands and rivers in preparation for their arrival. Torokin was a little too eager to get them to settle down. You will never lack food or water while on my land. And your people will always be welcome in my mountain if any concerns should arise. Torokin sounded hopeful. She wasn't dense enough to miss the signs of loneliness. The dragon wanted people to talk to. He didn't care about species or levels, he was just lonely. The lonely, old dragon was not as scary as he had seemed earlier. That being said, she was still aware of just what he was. A being capable of turning nations to ash. A species feared and hated by kings and gods. And in this case, a being so lonely that they became a bit of a fool around other people. The tense feeling that held her face vanished, and she felt her expression softening. Luke stifled his laughter as the dragon explained what he had done, but the humor on his face was evident. Torokin finally took notice of it and raised an eyebrow at him. What is that you find so humorous? Luke smiled as he responded. When is the last time you observed the mortal races? We have skills in magic that could build cities, but what I find so comical, is the endearing expression on my Valeria's face. As he spoke, he slowly turned toward her, and she realized that he was laughing at her. It seems like you have given up your suspicions rather quickly. You never told me that he was such an old fool. She hissed the words in a half-whisper that was easily overheard by the dragon. She tried and failed to stop her face from reddening. Then the worst thing happened, and Torokin laughed with Luke. Although, Torokin still responded in a gentle manner. Young one, just as a mouse might fear a cat, it is only right for you to be weary around me. Your husband Luke is far too careless. The words were meant to get her to relax, but they did the opposite. Luke was a god. Could someone really dwarf his power to such an extent? But you are deserving of our trust. She had wanted to question him with confidence but her voice broke and she squeaked out the last word. The drake smiled warmly, reminding her a little too much of Luke's father. Her own father was a far nastier man. I do not know, but I hope to become someone who is. For as long as you remain on my land, I will offer you the protection of a dragon. His voice boomed beyond just them. They hadn't moved far from the mountain, but she had the feeling his words were meant for everyone. The ground trembled with his shout. Her head swung around as the trees, bushes, and even the grass seemed to lean toward Torokin. She glanced at Luke who was watching the surroundings with the same amazement. Neither of them had sensed or felt any magic. The island was reaching for Torokin with loving arms. She saw it then. A future for them. A protector who would let them live as they wanted. Some things happened. We need to go back. Luke spoke quickly, launching himself into the air with a massive leap. She didn't hesitate and followed him a second later. The boots on her feet glowed faintly, as she started running in the air. She expected Torokin to join them in the air. Instead, he ran below them. The island seemed to move out of his way as he easily kept pace with her. Luke's jump had taken him further than her flight, and he was faster than her too. The forest beneath her blurred as she ran, and she arrived probably a minute after Luke. She saw him standing in front of a small group of people. The people were all beastkin, and they were laying on the ground. She saw the group and realized that it wasn't that small. Many more people stood around the ones on the ground. She could see some of them were coughing and clutching at their chest. When did so many people get sick? She descended on the beach beside Luke. He was bent over one of the people. It was a child with small, rounded ears on the top of their head. His chest rose so slowly, that she thought it wasn't moving initially. Her gaze darted over the rest of the group and she saw similar symptoms across them. The ones on the ground were obviously struggling even to breathe, and the people standing had scratching coughs. She stepped closer to Luke and noticed patches of greenish-yellow skin on the child's face. What's wrong? Luke should have been able to heal them. The hairs on the back of her neck rose, and her hands felt clammy as she repeated the question. What's wrong? It came out as a shout as Luke turned to her. His face was grim but focused. His hands shone gold as he touched the small boy. For the first time since his advancement, Luke looked a little pale. She instinctively reached for him, but he dodged her hand as if it were infected. "Don't touch me, or anyone. It spreads through contact." Luke's voice was as steady as always, but his eyes radiated doubt. Her own reply wasn't nearly as composed. "You can heal it." She wanted to sound certain, but the doubt on his face made her own voice quiver. Luke shook his head fractionally. "I don't know. When I tried to heal them, it made it worse. I think it's a curse. A living curse that's tricking the soul into thinking it's needed. My healing is helping it." His response cut off her pleas. Her mouth moved several times without any words actually coming out. Then she took a breath and focused. This wasn't the first time something bad had happened, and she wouldn't freak out just because of who it was targeting. "It must be skill designed to counter you. The gods you sensed earlier." She kept talking even as Luke shook his head. "No, you would have sensed it then. It must be a classer. Unlike thrones, aspects, and divinities, classers got power that wasn't obvious. When kings, gods, or monsters reached level 200, their achievement was shouted across the world. Classers didn't, they gained power in anonymity. That was the true advantage of that path." She glanced over the group of people, trying to figure out what to do. Who had it first? She settled on a question, her voice was empty of the earlier panic. There weren't a lot of ways to stop a skill like this. Not without the person who had the skill. She just needed to figure out who. Getting the person to surrender would be the easy part. "We don't know yet. I asked Trevin to find out. The problem is that the curse didn't activate until we arrived." He replied quickly but went back to the child in front of him. Luke was kneeling beside the child and was doing something to keep the kid alive. She considered what she could do and found nothing. Her powers were derived from Luke's in a way. She had attacks and skills designed to target the soul, but they weren't good at leaving things alive. Any attempt to help would end badly. A thought entered her mind, and she turned toward her new friend. Torokin stood a little apart from her and Luke. He was just observing the situation calmly, but his face was set in a frown. She still had some hope though. A dragon wasn't limited by the same system as far as she knew. Torokin might be able to counter the skill somehow. The dragon hesitated only a moment before walking beside Luke. He looked at her and then at Luke before speaking. "I am not a being of healing, nor is this something I have encountered before. However, I have vowed to protect you and will do what I can." So, saying, the dragon rested his hand on Luke's shoulder. Luke reacted first and slunk away from Torokin. The dragon didn't let go and held Luke as he tried to pull away. "You owe my people nothing." Luke spoke the words as he pushed Torokin's arm feebly. It was feeble only to the dragon. She could see the veins on Luke's arms bulge with the effort. Torokin smiled. "I have given you, my word." That was all he said. He reached down and touched the child. The boy's breathing steadied slightly, but he didn't get up. It took her a second to realize that Torokin had just put the boy to sleep. He glanced at her before speaking. "I have been infected as Luke had said. I would recommend that you distance yourself from others if at all possible. I will seek a cure with my own abilities though it might take some time." She nodded and took a few steps away from them. What could she do? Her head darted back and forth, as she looked over the people. Her people. She was no king or god, but they were her responsibility. Find who started this. If the curse didn't start till they got to the island, then maybe whoever used it was nearby. Trevin had skills meant for hunting and tracking, but she could at least fly around the island. "I'm going to look around." Torokin and Luke both nodded as they sat around the sick child. She glanced at them one last time. She swallowed the panic and fear that were at the edges of her mind. They had been in dire situations before. They always survived, and she always got her revenge. Chapter 356, Valeria PT3. Valerie was about to leave. Luke would find a way to stop the curse, she just needed to find who created it in the first place. A lot of people would die from something like this, and there would be blood for that. One of her skills activated, and her head shot up. A call for the soul was one of her best skills. It wasn't as good as foresight, but it gave her a sense of position. A sense that told her that she was about to be involved in something. It happened an instant later. The sky didn't so much as split as it broke. It was as if the sky was a glass pane, and someone had just thrown a rock through it. The effect seemed to be overlaid over the real world. 5 people appeared as the sky normalized. They stepped out of nowhere with what could only be described as a saunter. She didn't need a special sense to understand who they were. Luke rose to his feet, leaving the boy to Torokan. He glanced up at them. His body shone with golden light like a second sun. The light poured over everyone, and their bodies began to glow too. Valerie felt her senses sharpen. Her breathing came more easily, and her body felt stronger too. It was enough to at least help if a fight broke out. The problem was the numbers. Luke didn't seem bothered and shouted up at the crowd. "What do you want?" Luke's contempt was obvious from the way his shoulders were squared. He was never one for weapons, but he had very large, very intimidating arms. She caught a glimpse of his face and saw the smoldering anger blazing behind his eyes. The people floating above didn't react to the hostile expression at all. One of them, a man wearing a plain blue robe, descended slightly. A crown made of 3 silver diamonds floated a few inches above his head. She recognized him immediately. Lauren the Silver Prince was, in fact, a king. She only recognized one other person in the group. A man with orange, blonde hair, that seemed to move like it was made of fire. Evan of the Scorching Sands was a descendant of the King of Flames, an adventurer famous for inheriting his grandfather's fire. He was dangerous, but she felt a little relieved. Egan would have made the fight impossible. The other 3 were unknown to her, and that might be worse. Lauren stopped his descent a good 50 feet from Luke. His face was as impassive as a carved piece of metal. "We cannot let this alliance exist so freely. Offer us the dragon's life, and we will allow this nation to exist." Lauren's voice was too nasally for his muscular build, and it was nowhere near as deep or intimidating as it needed to be for that statement. Her response came quickly, and she strode up beside Luke with confidence. "You have no say here." Her voice was firm, unwavering. Lauren didn't look at her, didn't so much as acknowledge her existence. He just talked on as if she hadn't said a thing. "Dragons are our enemy. He is already infected, killing him will be simple now." Luke's face was cold, and Lauren ignoring her only made him angrier. His response was like a biting viper. "Valeria is right. You have no say here. Dragons are just like any other people. No, they are better. Your people have been far worse to mine than any dragon." Valeria smirked up at Lauren, whose eyebrows knit together sharply. Her eyes smoldered with unhidden fury as she gave Lauren her best glare. The elven prince's face reddened as he responded. "Did becoming a god make you a fool? Dragons have long since been the enemy of our kingdoms. How can you forgive their crimes?" Valerie's sharp tone and tongue cut his incredulity apart. "Your kingdoms and your crimes. They were never mine." Lauren couldn't ignore that, and his angry eyes darted toward her for an instant. "Enough of this, you can die with the dragon then." The prince swiped his hand to the side. A hand of silvery light flashed into existence beside her, and she braced for an impact that never came. Luke's soul grew and morphed around her into a dome of radiant golden light. The silver and gold clashed in an eruption of blinding light. She was painfully aware of the fact that Luke's soul didn't actually touch her. It made her want to reach out to it, but that would spit in the face of what he was doing to protect her. She hated being the one who needed protection. And she wouldn't let it stay that way. Valeria's class wasn't the most dynamic, but she was good at hitting above her weight class. Luke's buffs only amplified that effect. She raised her left palm up at Lauren. It flashed purple and she twisted her wrist sharply. The prince let out a howl of agony, as visible cuts appeared across his body and part of his robes were stained red. He clutched at the robes on his chest tightly as if his heart was in pain. She was attacking something much deeper than a heart though, and there were few things that could defend a soul from her attacks. Lauren moved through the pain in a sharp motion. His arm swung down and a beam of silvery light big enough to consume a small town fell upon them. Her head spun toward the rest of the beach. Her people would be unable to block or survive an attack like that. Luke's soul radiated out of him like an umbrella. Golden light formed a protective shell around everyone and met the incoming silver power. The two collided and sparks of multicolored light filled the air. It looked like a dozen stars exploding. Even under the light of the sun, the collision of power was blinding. She still had a hold of Lauren's soul and twisted it further. Lauren's silver beam faltered as he cried out in pain. He was yelling for his allies, who also seemed to enjoy Lauren's pain. It seemed like the prince had a bad relationship with his group. One of the groups did move though. A bow of flowing flames formed between his arms, and he knocked an unseen arrow. He lost but nothing came out. She glanced toward Torokan assuming that he was targeting someone else, but the dragon wasn't there. Although she didn't have the time to wonder where he had gone. The air around her arm went from warm to scalding in an instant, and a line of fire exploded through her arm. She let out a high shriek of pain like the wails of cat and pulled her arm back. It hung uselessly at her side, as the skin around her elbow had turned black. The bone beneath was visible, and it had melted together into a disgusting mass. She swallowed her cries as the golden light around her body already began healing her wound. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a bronze sheet of metal blocking out the sun. It took her an instant to even see the full thing, and she realized it was a wing. She traced it with her eyes to find Torokan in the air above them. He was heading toward the five, and her mouth fell open at the sight. Torokan was massive. Each movement of his wing sounded like a typhoon and the wind buffeted the ground as he charged forward. The dragon's scales shone with a bronze radiance, and his mouth was wide open as if to devour the elven prince. He was more than big enough to swallow a small house whole, and she could see Lauren struggle to evade. Her attack had staggered the prince, and she could see the color drain from Lauren's face as he looked toward the dragon. Evan reacted the fastest of the bunch. The bow in his hands vibrated as bursts of flame exploded across Torokan's scales. Torokan didn't seem to care at all. Torokan's chest began to glow with a reddish light. It spread from the dragon's belly and flowed through his neck. The spines that crawled down his back began flashing red. Everyone knew what was coming. It was the kind of legendary image that stories were told of. Evan dove out of the way but the other four remained and braced for the attack. A silvery hand formed between the group and Torokan. Crystals of every color grew out of the other's body like a fungus and created a sharp wedge-shaped shield. Valerie expected Torokan to release a breath of hot fire. All the previously recorded fights with dragons led her to believe that. It was wrong. Torokan's breath was not flame, but sand. It was the same black sand she had seen on the beach, and it came out in a rush. A line was so dense and black that she only noticed it was sand by the small grains that fell upon them like rain. The bar of darkness touched the silver palm and tore through it. It cut through it like a blade and shattered the crystal shield as if it were glass. The final barrier was one that she hadn't been able to see. The sand crashed into the invisible shield colliding against the very air in an explosion of sand. The black sand spread over the sky like a dark cloud, it outlined the final shield as it fell around it. It was as if the air itself had hardened into a large pentagonal shield. Why would someone use that shape? It was a dumb question to have. It was time to return to the fight, and her eyes darted to the left of the group where Evan was preparing to fire more arrows. Time for some vengeance. Both of her hands glowed purple. She could barely move one, but it did move. Luke's healing worked quickly, and she could ignore some pain. She made a grabbing motion at Evan, and his head instantly spun toward her. Valeria smiled like a wicked witch. Luke had often said that it was a smile to frighten children, but she couldn't control it. She loved the adrenaline that came with a fight, and it was burning within her like a bonfire. Leaving the group to Luke and Torokan, she decided to pursue the one who was alone. Valerie pulled on Evan. The higher-level man held his ground but sweat built on his forehead. Everything she did targeted the soul, and they hurt. It was akin to pulling on someone's organs. Even if they held strong, it would still hurt. The pull had the reverse effect though, and she used it to propel herself across the sky. Wind raced past her and some of the sand in the air scratched her face as she closed the distance rapidly. The bow in Evan's hand changed to a sword, and he swung quickly. The sand in the air saved her. She was able to see how his swing burned across the air in a projected wave as the sand it touched melted. She kicked to the left, her boots creating an artificial foothold for her to push off of. She spun around the incoming wave and pulled again on Evan's soul. She was about to touch him, but her hand instead passed through him. Her whole body went right through the man. The light burns across her exposed skin made her turn. She had gone over a dozen paces past him, but the effect was obvious. The man's body was made of fire, and he was grinning at her. "Did you really think I would let you touch me? The famous witch of black hands." His smile quickly vanished as he noticed the skill that made her famous. Her hands were coated in a black liquid as if she had pulled her hand out of a bucket of ink. Although the drops that fell from her hands turned into a mist long before hitting the ground. "You know you're the second person with a full body skill like that I have fought. She died making the same assumption you did." She stood hovering in the air and moved before the man could attempt to do anything. Thrusting her hands out in front of her, she pictured them tearing through the man. Her hands were spread open, her fingers were like claws that dug into the very air. Evan's face had lost its color, and she pried her fingers apart. She left black trails in the air. The streaks reminded her of torn paper. Evan was staring at her clutched at a body that was quickly failing him. He had been torn in two at a fundamental level. Few things had the ability to restore their soul or live in such a state. Evan was not one, though he was trying. Flames danced between the two halves of his body, desperately attempting to connect the two pieces together. She wouldn't let that happen. Her fingers thrust out again, and this time she moved her hands vertically. Evan's body split again, his life left him as her mana rapidly vanished. Chapter 357, The Necromancer's Rise. She fell from the sky like a bird that suddenly lost its wings. Her boots needed a very small amount of mana, but she had nothing. Knowing that she would survive the fall, she moved her attention to the rest of the battle. Luke and Torokan were fighting admirably, but they were noticeably slowing. The curse seemed to spread faster as they fought. Luke's resplendent golden visage was marred with spots like rust. She noticed it almost immediately, and Torokan was fearing worse. He didn't seem to have much in the way of defense, relying almost entirely on his scales. That might work for most enemies, but the curse was affecting him too. Some of his scales looked old and she could spot a few cuts across his body. Some shards of crystal were embedded in his wings, and she watched as the crystals grew. Valeria wanted to help right away but knew better. She would be more than useless without mana. Her role was to kill, and she needed a lot of mana to do that. Her head turned toward the ground as she was about to collide with some trees. She spread her body out as best she could and scratched and hit as many branches as possible. It slowed her fall enough that she managed to land on her hands and knees and not her head. That didn't stop the pain. It felt like she had just been stoned. The pain would fade with Luke's magic, even if he weren't actively watching her. She sat down folding her legs into a meditative pose. Controlling her breathing was hard for two reasons. The first was the adrenaline that made her want to charge headlong into the next fight, and the other was the sand. It was everywhere. She spat to the side to get what she could out of her mouth and pulled her shirt's collar over her nose as a makeshift mask. Despite all that, she managed to meditate. She was used to doing it in bad places. Maybe a minute passed when the sand on her skin and hair was pulled off of her. It floated off her like insects flying back to their hive. She watched them and desperately wanted to see what was happening beyond the cover of the trees, but she still needed more time. A cracking noise from her side made her jump to her feet. Her hands had already begun glowing purple, though it was faint compared to the earlier light. The light vanished as she saw Luke push through the trees. His body faintly shone with light, and he was hurt. One of his arms was missing, replaced by a golden copy. Numerous smaller cuts and wounds covered his arms and legs. If he wasn't healing that, it must mean the curse was getting bad. She approached him, but he held a hand up to stop her. "Don't come closer." His voice was hoarse and dry, and he audibly wheezed with every breath. She stared at him and nodded slowly. He continued to speak as soon as she did. "Advance. You killed Evan, so you should be able to do it. Try for a class that can stop the curse, or at least something to kill them if not. I will protect you." Luke's voice was surprisingly warm as he encouraged her to advance. Torokan's roar was like thunder as it shook the island like a massive earthquake. Luke smiled slightly. "I think that counts as a promise too." Speaking was obviously hard for him, but he still managed to smile. His teeth were a little bloody, but the smile on his face was somehow genuine. She nodded and sat back down. Shutting her eyes, she shifted her focus inward and felt the ground beneath her vanish. Her eyes snapped open, and she gazed at two very distinct and opposite pillars of light. One was purple and familiar. Its power called to her own abilities, and she knew the class would improve what she could already do. She tentatively reached out to it and felt the information flood her mind. "God of the thrill, the soul of battle, you have forsaken all that you were and committed to a shard of true divinity. The thrill is the life of battles, the lust that invades the mind when standing before your enemies. Combat grants you power like no other. A prayer in battle is a prayer to you. Thrive off the lust of battle that fills the mind of soldiers and heroes. You crave nothing but battle. It is the core of your very being. You are the soul of battle, and the battle is within your soul. Strike at your enemies with the unbridled desire for the carnage that burns within you. As a god, you inherit a part of divinity. Your world will change to accommodate the new owner of the shard. Your power is fundamental to the structure of the world, as such you will be bound to that world and those it has suborned. This choice will change the class system to the god system. That sounded wonderful. It filled her mind with wonderful images of vengeance, though she pushed it away. For all that the power called out to her, it wouldn't give her the ability to save anyone. Especially not Luke or Torokan. In another situation, she wouldn't hesitate to pick the class. It would let her become a god like Luke, plus it would give her enough power to help protect the island. She could have become a visage to rival other nations on her own. She looked toward the other pillar. It was grey and dim, barely managing to illuminate its surroundings. It was a disappointing color. Her hand drifted toward it, and she felt the information rush into her head. Mother of Death. The Mother of Death is an advanced class that will grant you powers anew. Become one who manipulates the life and death of others. As the Mother of Death, you give life to the dead and grant death to those that live. Without life, there is no death, and without death, there is no life. Your understanding of this rule grants you the ability to tear away your own life and death to bestow it on another. It was vague. That was the first thought she had after learning of the class. The class itself didn't sound too bad, but she didn't like the idea of working with the dead. She had worked with a handful of death mages before, and it was usually their scent that really bothered her. The class didn't speak to her as much as the previous one, but it offered her a chance. There was no guarantee that this class would give her the ability to save Luke and the others. Who knows? They might not even need to be saved. She couldn't risk it though. The simple fact that this class might offer an immediate solution to the curse was enough of a reason to pick it. In truth, she probably had enough offensive power, that the first class probably would have been excessive. That thought was the one that convinced her to take a new class. Everyone wanted power, but people with nothing but power didn't, or couldn't, actually do a lot. It truly didn't take that much to take a life, and she was already one of the best at it. They needed versatility right now, she just hoped it gave her enough power to get her vengeance too. With that debate settled, she reached for the pale grey pillar. The world around her vanished, and she returned to her body only to see it devoid of any color. It was as if some had bled the world of what made it beautiful. It was a mass of whites and blacks to her eyes now, and she rose to her feet shakily. Her body didn't feel overfull with power like her last advancement. It felt strange. Her chest felt surprisingly empty. Then she saw it. Luke was on the ground, kneeling with his back to her. His hands were held in front of him like a shield against the very world. He wasn't moving. The muscles on his neck didn't shift at all, and she realized in a moment of disturbing calm that he was dead. Her body froze, and she just stared at him. Valeria didn't weep. Her heart didn't ache. She felt it should. She felt that she should cry, and wail until her throat grew dry and hoarse. None of that happened though. The only thing she did was stare. After a few moments like that, her knees began to shake and her whole body vibrated a little. Her hands felt unsteady, and she couldn't even find the strength to tighten them into fists. A question popped into her mind. Why hadn't they killed her? Why only Luke? Shakily, she raised one hand to clutch at her chest. She would tear out her own heart if she could. Her hand met water, and she winced as a flash of pain thrummed through her. Pulling her hand away in alarm, she shifted her gaze away from Luke. There was a literal hole in her chest, right where her heart should be. It was a little bigger than her fist, and it bore straight through her. How? She was a classer. Why was she alive when Luke wasn't? The questions bounced around in her head, as she felt the call of her new powers. It was not the call of souls that she remembered vividly. If anything, it felt like the opposite. The call of a body that was now missing its soul. Luke's corpse called to her, but she didn't touch it. She knew that she could bring him back. Offer it a piece of her soul. But it would be fake. Even without checking her status, she knew what she could do. The class had come with a new sense, and she didn't want to bring Luke back as anything but himself. She felt others though. Many, many others. Torokan's body was still here, and she felt 3 others at Luke's level. Evan was close enough that she would grab him first. Grief and pain were something for later. Her enemies were still on the island, and she would get her vengeance. She walked slowly, still unsure of how her body was moving at all. A part of her told her to check her status, but another part told her not to. If she knew what she was about to do, then she felt like she wouldn't go through with it. As she moved through the forest, she had to brush aside branches and noticed how dead the island felt now. The grass was wilting, and the tree's leaves littered the ground as if it were autumn. The branches were brittle and dry, some of them even snapped under feeble strength. It took maybe 5 minutes to get to Evan's body. She had torn it to pieces, but it still called for her power. Like a baby that needed to be fed, she heard its cry and knew how to feed it. To her eyes, the world had become nothing but blacks and whites, but the body in front of her pulsed with red flashes of fire, anger, and rage. She knew what to do. Her hands dripped with the black inkiness that she had used to kill Evan before, and she reached into herself. She grabbed her own soul, ripped out a piece of her own hatred and anger and offered it to the body like a baby's bottle. Only after giving up that piece of her soul, did she check her status. It was too late to turn back now. Midweek. Chapter. He crumpled the scroll in his hand, the thin paper bent as he squeezed it. He stared at the guild master's door before him and hesitated. Dark brown wood, with a silver frame that sparkled from regular cleaning, made it seem expensive. The fact that it was 10 feet tall made that expense frightening, and the permanent blue lighting of the building made the door feel ominous. They really should change from blue lights to colorless ones, even if they were more expensive. The door was as imposing as the old woman behind it. The guildmaster was a nice enough person, but she wouldn't be happy with his objections. Assignments were completed without questions or hesitation, his connection to her wouldn't matter one bit. It was practically the motto of the Scribes Guild to never discuss anything of import, so most people in it never talked about work and never with the guildmaster. Ness was about to do just that, and he didn't like the idea. One hand held the scroll tightly, and he moved the other through his black hair. He pushed it back as best as he could and flattened any loose ends. He alone had the privilege to meet the guildmaster freely, and she would tolerate far less if he didn't look neat. As such he patted down the black vest of his uniform and adjusted his tie briefly. He made sure his shirt was tucked in properly and adjusted his glasses. As he pushed his glasses up his nose, he wondered why he was even wearing them. Slowly, he took a long breath and pulled his glasses off. The guildmaster would understand. Knock. Knock. His gloved hand struck the door loudly. He had already made sure that no one else was inside, but he still knocked regardless. The last time he had walked in uninvited had ended in a month of work without pay. It was not a fate he wanted to experience again. He waited patiently for the response, and after a few seconds, he got one. "Don't just stand there. Come in." The voice from the other side was old and snappy. Her voice held all the responsibility of someone who acted as if they had lived far too long already. He sighed audibly as he pushed open the door, and he tried not to sound annoyed in his response. "Last time I did that, I got punished, Grandma." His grandmother smiled slightly when she heard the familiar name. The name that had stuck around, ever since he mispronounced grandmother as a kid. Grana, it wasn't her name, but she hated it when he addressed her any other way. Back when he had first moved to Leonard, he struggled not to blush when saying it. "No, I did that because you lost 3 gold coins gambling. The door thing was just an excuse, although if that is the reason you have been so quiet recently, maybe I should punish you again." She replied easily while continuing to scribble away on some document. Despite being nearly 80, her hands moved in a blur across the page. "Wait, really?" The sudden realization that his hard work and fear had been for nothing made him fumble a clever response. He decided it was time to bring up the assignment. She couldn't have a clever response for that one. Just thinking about it made him angry, and the anger helped him compose himself. "Fine, that doesn't matter anyways. What in the shades is this?" He held up the now crumpled scroll to her. She didn't bother reading it but did set down her gilded pen. She didn't say anything, just crossed her arms over her chest and leaned back in her large cushioned chair. Her black eyes met his and didn't waver in the slightest. Both of their eyes were colored black from their skills, so he couldn't see where her iris ended, and her pupil began. She saw the same thing in his own gaze as he matched her. Then he faltered. "Sorry, but I'm serious. I'm not doing this, I'm a scribe, not a warrior." He broke first. He hadn't meant to curse but it had just come out, and shades wasn't the worst thing he could say. Despite the apology, he pushed her for a response. "Yes, and all you will be doing is writing letters. It is perfectly safe." Her voice didn't sound annoyed, but condescending as she disregarded his anger. "I can do that here, I don't need to go the Eastern Front for that. I'm a scribe, I'll die." He couldn't keep his voice straight and had been nearly yelling at the end. Plus, he was angry. How could his grandmother send him to a battlefield? He had lived with his grandmother for almost 5 years now, and he felt betrayed and alone. She scoffed. Please, you'll be perfectly safe. I'm sending you to Fort West River. You and I both know that it is safe. There is standing agreement to spare any non-combatants too. I feel like you're missing the point. I'm a scribe. I have no talent or skills to help me survive anywhere near a fight. And the agreement means little, or am I supposed to tell a random fireball to leave me alone since I'm a scribe? I feel like that won't work. If you say, I'm a scribe one more time, I will stab you. And don't get sarcastic with me. She threatened him openly as she lifted her pen. He nodded. Her grandmother's pen could cut through solid steel if she wanted. Her most powerful skill. Nothing may stop my words. It was her most famous ability. It literally made it so that she could write on whatever she wanted, and anything between her pen and the canvas got cut away. He had seen her use it literally to chop down a tree. He swallowed loudly. She wasn't done speaking though. The fort has never been attacked in over 100 years. Furthermore, you are the youngest, and most fit scribe here. Not to mention you have foreign language comprehension, which is the only requirement of the job. Finally, they said they would reward you with a blue job crystal. Seriously? Now that was something he almost didn't believe. Not the part about him being the most fit. Everyone else in the guild, other than his grandmother, was kind of fat and old, and he was mostly fit. He had a little bit of extra fat around his face, but it wasn't anything egregious. It was the last bit that surprised him. A blue crystal was valuable, and it could turn his life around. It would have tempted almost anyone. Anyone but him. He smiled as he noticed the hopeful look in his grandmother's eyes. He made his next words especially sharp. I don't want to be famous. I don't want to become an enchanter or spell scribe. Well, you're a failure as a scribe. You have 2 absolutely worthless skills. Inkwell is useless in a guild, and basic penmanship is just crap. Unless you gained another skill without me noticing, you have no use here. You need fast writing or quick hands to work in a proper guild. His grandmother's words cut like a knife. He didn't have another skill to show her, and his skills were indeed bad. They were fine, maybe even good, on a battlefield. In a city like this, they were garbage. It had just been a matter of luck, and there was nothing he could do to change it. So what? Just because I'm a bad scribe, you want me to go and die? Really? Don't put words in my mouth. You could have been a farmer, woodworker, or something else. But you chose to be a scribe because you thought I would go easy on you. If you don't want to sweat while you work, then do the work that I give you. She was angry now and was shouting right back at him. I have no talent for any of that, especially fighting. Does being successful really matter? He didn't shout this time, he just sounded disappointed and a little resigned. How can you know where your talents lie, if you never put in the effort needed to see that talent bloom? And it does matter. Trust me. Trust my experience. Nobody is happy in failure. Try your best on this job and get those final 2 skills. Then when you get the blue crystal, if you still don't want to use it, I won't force you to use it. You can just sell it and live comfortably. She stopped shouting and spoke gently, but with the certainty that only someone old could have. Fine. He grumbled the word now that he was fully resigned to his fate. Good, I already informed Jessica to get some supplies ready. You can pick them up before you leave, you'll even get a personal identification badge for this. His eyes lit up at that information, and he glanced up at her. A personal badge was expensive. It was worth 50 gold pieces, which was half a year of his wages. That bit of information did make him feel a little better. He nodded at his grandmother and turned to leave. His grandmother cleared her throat loudly. Forgetting something. She said it sweetly and slowly rose out of her chair. He saw her struggle a little bit and noticed the worry on her face too. With almost no hesitation, he walked over to her. She stood there, a head shorter than him. She wore a thick floral print sundress that was so yellow it might offend someone. Its baggy sleeves swayed as she spread her arms open. Even after everything that had been said, he loved her. He bent over and let her pull him into a hug. She squeezed him tightly, and he repeated the gesture though he tried to be gentle. Her skills let her do amazing things, but her body was still frail and she always felt so small at times like these. Her grey hair brushed against his face, and he really felt just how old she really was. My little mess. Be safe and get cleaned up, maybe then I won't be able to call you that anymore. His grandmother whispered the words to him. He couldn't help but smile at the stupid and familiar pet name. The mission meant that he wouldn't see her for several months, and that fact only hit now. He pulled away first and almost asked why. If she was going to act like this now, why send him away? Then he saw the expression on her face and stopped. In some twisted way, she was doing this for him, and it hurt her just as much as he. Thank you, I'll see you soon, Grandma. He smiled for her sake and walked away quickly. He was too old to rely on his grandmother anymore, but he also didn't want to leave her either. Well, after all of that, he could at least try his best. He didn't linger. Mostly because he didn't have that much time left in the city period. The caravan he was supposed to join was leaving in 4 hours. He left his grandmother's office and ran for the stairs. The Scribes Guild was large, and he passed several noticeably open doors. People had been listening into their conversation. He ignored the smiling faces who waved or said goodbye as he ran. When your grandmother ran the guild, every old person tended to treat you like their own grandkid. He didn't have the time to talk to each of them, and just one conversation would start a dozen others. He ran through the hall, which was lit by mana crystals. It was the most basic type since blue was the natural color of mana. Each other type required an enchanter and was expensive. Most people just used normal candles or lanterns, but his grandmother hated the idea of fire within the guild. So, every part of the build was given an ominous blue glow. Even after 5 years here, he hated it and the color blue. The bottom floor of the guild was massive and empty. The walls were brown like the rest of the wooden building, but they were covered in so many paintings that he could barely see them. The floors, on the other hand, were completely bare. His grandmother outright rejected any type of carpet, claiming that they would be a pain to care for. Despite all that, the counter that the receptionist stood behind was incredibly elaborate. The wood was carved and covered in small etchings. It was covered in a story, a retelling of how the first Scribes Guild was formed. He ran up to the desk, ignoring the line at the opposite end of the room. There were maybe a dozen people in it. He spotted Jessica at the end. She was a poor receptionist, in that, she never actually spoke to any customers. She basically solely handled jobs for Grana, of which there were precious few. He ran up to her. She was a bird beastkin, or a harpy as they were typically called, and she had a set of wings rather than human arms. They were multicolored and beautiful and were the primary reason she was appointed. She could fly, which made her especially good at running messages for Gran. She smiled at him as he approached and shoved a bag toward him with a taloned foot. Thanks. He nodded to her as he grabbed the bag. It's the job. She shook her head slowly. Her ponytail swished back and forth, the rainbow hair drew his attention immediately. Jessica was incredibly beautiful, and he had even asked her out once, only to find that she was married and over a decade older than him. Apparently, harpies just looked young. He opened the bag eagerly and pulled out the small metal plate, a thin chain was connected to it too. He saw Jessica's eyes widen at the badge. She knew what it was. The plate was about as long as his thumb, and twice as wide. He didn't hesitate to bite his finger and press a drop of blood onto the thing. Slowly words started to appear on it. On one side his name, age, and job appeared. On the other, it displayed his skills. He turned it over in his hands, examining both sides with glee as the information engraved itself into the metal. Name, Ness. Age, 22. Major job, scribe. Minor job, locked. Inkwell. Locked. Basic penmanship. Locked. Foreign language comprehension. Locked. Open. Locked. Open. Locked. He didn't care that it told the world he was a failure. So, what if most people his age already had all 5 of their skills and are saving up to buy another job crystal? None of that mattered to him as he stared at the precious object. The tool that would save him from having to get appraised at a church. They didn't charge anything, but people with money were expected to make donations. Plus, there was always a long line. Now, he just got to keep this, and no one could take it away from him either. Well, he guessed they could steal it, but it wouldn't matter. Once someone bonded a badge, it would stay tied to them forever. It was already his most valuable item. He spent a full 5 minutes just holding the thing, before looking through the rest of the bag. It was a traditional brown backpack in appearance. There wasn't anything remarkable inside, but the bag itself was valuable. It was a dimensional bag, a small one, and it would be extremely useful. Currently, it held several changes of clothing, bathing stuff, and some writing supplies. That was all that could fit inside, but he was glad to have it nonetheless. Other than that, the caravan would provide him with things like food, water, and a place to sleep. Just like that, he had everything he needed. Now it was time to spend some of his savings on things he didn't need but wanted to have anyways. 3 days later. Ness bounced in his seat, and his hand shot through the parchment of the letter he had been drafting. He slammed the wood behind him with his fist. Even for all of his strength, the thump wasn't that loud. "I'm trying to write in here," he shouted out of the wooden caravan and received a laugh in return. The person leading the horses of his cart was called Buck on account of his overly large front teeth. Ness wouldn't ever claim to be close to a man he didn't know the real name of, but Buck had been the only person he really talked to on the trip. Ness's position awarded him certain privileges like a personal wagon filled to the brim with writing supplies and a table with a bench. It could reasonably fit 2 people, but he had it to himself. The wagon wasn't all that big despite that. It had a bench against the front wall, with a tiny table that he could slide down to whatever height he wanted. At night, he lined it up with the bench to make a pseudo-bed for himself. The bench was nothing more than a wooden plank with a long rectangular pillow at the bottom. There weren't even any windows. Instead, the unremarkable brown wood was illuminated by a single blue crystal jammed into the ceiling. Having been in the wagon for 3 days now, he could confidently describe it as suffocating. He still preferred it in here, because everyone outside felt the need to talk to him. Not many people learned to write properly. Oh, some if not most could read at a passable level, but they didn't bother to learn how to write. Having a scribe in their caravan, apparently meant a convenient and cheap way to get some letters written. He had somewhat known to expect that and had told them he would do 1 letter for free for each of them. Since there were around 20 people in total, it meant he was busy. It also meant that they had given him rather long and elaborate letters to draft. He amended his statement and said he couldn't spare more than 2 pages for each of them. They were more than pleased to hear it. Honestly, they seemed grateful that he was willing to do anything for them. Ness liked most of them, but they kept asking him if he was almost done. He was getting tired of promising people that he would finish by the time they arrived. There were still another 2 days and he only had 3 letters left to write. He was just dragging it on to avoid getting any more requests. It was lazy and wouldn't get him any skills, but he wasn't worried about it. For a scribe, writing a letter for someone important was usually enough to award a skill. A letter used to communicate with a foreign army would definitely get him his last 2 skills. He was certain about that and had confirmed it once at the library before leaving town. It had been a good decision to go to the library because now he knew what skills to aim for. One skill was called urgent message. It would make it so that his letter would fly to their destination without a courier. The paper would simply fold itself into a bird or something and zip off to its destination. It might not be the most discreet skill, but it was a good one. Plus, if he got that blue crystal and got a magical job, the skill would probably upgrade into distant message or enchanted origami. The second skill was the one he wanted. It would let him make paper golems that could do simple chores for him. He paused basking in the idea, before noticing the tear in the letter again. He sighed and reached into his pouch for some tape. His hands dug in the larger-than-it-looked pack for the tape. He found it. It was a white sticky substance that resembled parchment on one side. It was a recent thing made by some scribe in the capital. It was simple, you used it to fix any tears in the paper, and then just wrote on top of it. Whoever made it was truly a genius. He would praise anyone that made his life easier. He began taping the paper together when the cart shook again. This time it wasn't a gentle nudge but a violent crash that tossed him out of his seat and into the opposite wall. He barely even processed what was happening as the cart tipped on its side. The sudden shift in the floor and the wall made him tumble over his head. He fell in a mess of limbs, and his small carton of ink splashed over his shirt. Dizzily, he reoriented himself. The wall was now the floor, and the only exit was on the opposite end of the bench. Thankfully it wasn't that large of a carriage. Ness was not in a good mood anymore and was definitely going to give Buck a hard time. Then his brain actually understood the situation. A fall like this wasn't because of poor driving. As if to confirm his thought, a scream filled the air. It was high-pitched and female, and the sound ended in a way he didn't like. He scrambled to his feet. The wall at his feet bent a little from his weight. It wasn't designed for a man to stand on. It made him feel fat and was entirely the stupidest thing to worry about. He scrambled for the bench, using its side to pull himself up to the door. It didn't even have a lock and swung open easily. A rush of hot air ran over him, as he hoisted his head out of the carriage. The scene outside was insane. 2 of the carriages were flaming piles of rubble. People in dirty green and brown armor were running through the caravan and killing everyone. The guards weren't that strong, but they weren't able to put up a fight at all. It was a disturbing sight, to say the least. "Get down!" Buck shouted the word. Ness turned to see the large front teeth of Buck in a vicious snarl. The man had a bow in hand and fired it at one of the dirty men. Ness listened to the command instinctively but had no idea what was happening. His head dropped a little, but he still watched as the arrow slammed into someone. They fell from one of the nearby trees. Now Ness noticed all of the archers in the trees. The path they were on was a simple one. A slightly elevated dirt road that cut through what was supposed to be a secure forest. Short trees with large leaves framed the road. He had liked the trees before, but now he was terrified of them as they hid the bandits well. Every shadow might as well be a man with a bow. Only now did his mind actually understand what was happening. They were being attacked by bandits, and a capable group too. He would have laughed if fear wasn't making him panic. His eyes darted back and forth, and he seriously considered if it would be better to climb out and prostrate himself on the ground. They might let him go once they found out he was a rather terrible scribe. His eyes caught on something large, red and hot flying toward him. A fireball. One of the simplest and most devastating skills a person could have. It hurtled toward him, and he knew that he couldn't get away. Not stuck in the carriage as he was. He couldn't help but remember the conversation from a few days ago. And he managed a faint whisper, 3 words that might constitute a prayer. "I'm a scribe." Then the world turned red as pain, heat and an explosion sent him into unconsciousness. Chapter 358, The Island Dragon. Mash hovered in the air with Luke and the others. In the distance, he could barely make out the island that was the home of the necromancer. It was a strange thing to see, even after getting Luke's description of the place. The beaches were coated in black sand, trees covered nearly all the visible land. They had large wide leaves that shielded the terrain below from his gaze, and probably the sunlight too. A few rivers crisscrossed across the island, dividing it like a slice of meat. He stared at the island and searched for the dragon he was supposed to fight. Luke didn't tell them much about the necromancer, though he did give them some warning about what to expect. Naturally, Mash was supposed to fight the strongest ones. One of which should include an enormous undead dragon. Possibly an undead version of Luke himself, and several other people around that level of power. Mash had agreed to the plan almost immediately. Was it dangerous? Yes, there was almost no situation where it wasn't dangerous. Did the others tell him not to do it? Everyone but Luke had tried to convince him not to do it. Was there a chance that Luke would betray him and use the necromancer to try and kill him? Yet, as much as he hated to distrust his friend, Mash couldn't help but consider the possibility. Even with all those reasons not to fight, Mash still accepted the role. There were 3 primary reasons why. The first was that he could probably escape any situation. Priscilla would be able to tell Jill to pull him out of any risky situation. The other reason was simple. He wanted to trust Luke, and getting someone like the necromancer as an ally would be significant. He might not know a lot about her, but she had to be high level and strong. The final reason was the fact that he would get to fight a dragon. Undead though it might be, it would be a serious fight, unlike the spar with Athas. Plus, she was just supposed to be young, and he wanted to see what a dragon could actually do. Those weren't all the thoughts or reasons he had on the matter, but they had been enough to get him here. The island wasn't that far now. Luke would give a signal at some point, and Mash was supposed to make a loud entrance. He had considered how he would do this. Any of his magical combinations could devastate an island if he really wanted to, although the island would probably have some kind of protection against magic like that. Otherwise, someone else would have done that by now. Mash had come up with another idea. His body was even more changeable than it was before. He didn't need to use wooden magic to craft a fake body for himself. His magic would let him change his body in truth to mimic another creature, and he could take it a step further. The transformation would take a few minutes, but he knew he had the time, and he would probably need to rest afterward. Mash closed his eyes and formed an image in his head of the form he wanted to take. He didn't have the knowledge to do it on his own. However, Priscilla did, and she helped him construct the body so that it would actually function as he wanted it to. His body grew rapidly, the new skin was not wood but neither was it flesh. It was an abomination of magic that really shouldn't be part of a living being. His skin was some blend of bark and scale. At first, the semi-wooden scales were small, but his body grew, and they did too. Wings sprouted from his back, each one big enough to cast a shadow over a town. His limbs grew longer, as his neck bulged forward. His nose stretched into a snout and his teeth surpassed even daggers. A tail grew from his back as his legs became thicker than tree trunks. The tail ended at a sharp point that looked dangerous. Even after all that was done, his body continued to grow beyond that. He used nearly all of his energy for the transformation, and let it grow to the limits of his power. Once the fight started, he would continue to grow bigger, but he stopped when the last bits of his energy ran out. Even without a lot of energy, he could keep himself in the air with the power of his new wings. Normally, dragons needed to use magic to fly, their bodies were simply too large otherwise. Priscilla had another solution, and she just made his wings big enough to handle the weight. There was one other trick that let him fly as he did. He was not just a dragon. Mash had come up with the idea when sparring with Athas, and he finally found the opportunity to test it. Mash managed to blend a dragon and a treant together into an abomination that would never be born naturally. It worked exactly as he envisioned too. Mash had grown to surpass any castle. It had drained him thoroughly enough that he needed to take a break and recover his energy. Closing his eyes, he began recovering his energy while hovering in the air. Begin anew was several times more effective than the previous iteration of the skill, and he recovered his energy relatively quickly. It took about 5 minutes for him to recover completely. Once done, he just waited for Luke to contact him. Mash could make his body even larger. Grow to the point where his landing alone would crush mountains, but that would take a lot longer. Plus, they didn't want to destroy the island that much. That was the hardest part of the whole thing. Mash wasn't supposed to actually kill anything, and he was banned from using either of his aspects. They were all half convinced that the aspect of freedom would cause all the undead to go on a rampage, and change was too much of an unknown. He had to fight without them, but apparently, the undead wouldn't have their equivalents either. Luke is ready. Mash was shaken from his thoughts as Priscilla told him the time had come. Mash let out a long breath which echoed as it passed through his mouth. He spread his wings as wide as he could, and he ascended into the air. There was little doubt in his mind that more than just the necromancer was watching him. His size alone would probably pose a threat to many nations, and he could practically feel the numerous attempts to scry him. Mash chuckled. With his new body, it sounded more like the rumble of thunder. Mash wasn't slow for all that his body had grown. He soared into the air quickly, flying far over the island as he made his approach. A thin stream of air changed as it approached him at incredible speed. Mash turned, rolling out of the way. It took him a second to realize what it had been. Hot air. Well, air that was so hot that it would likely burn through anything it touched. It didn't touch him though, and he began his descent. Mash tucked his wings in and curled his limbs and claws together tights. He turned from a kite that had blotched out the sun, to a falling asteroid in an instant. Mash saw more beams of heat shoot out from the island like harpoons. Even without his wings, Mash could stop the beams. He focused his own magic, strengthening the aura of the end with his anti-magic. At this range, that was enough to destabilize magic and lessen the heat. He still felt it as hot air washed over his body in a much less concentrated manner. It was as if he had stuck his head over the blazing oven. The heat crawled across his body, but he continued his fall unturned. Mash would cushion the impact himself, but he expected the necromancer to have the tools to stop him. He tucked his head in and turned into a literal ball as his domain managed to cover a part of the island. That alone would be enough to guide his landing. Mash watched as something burst forth from the trees. No, it was deeper than that. Something came from the ground rising into the air to meet him. A creature large enough to almost match his own size flew into the air. The ground it tore it up surged behind it, following it to the skies. The broken trees sharpened into lances, and the stone and dirt turned into misshapen swords. Mash opened his wings moments before colliding with the approaching dragon and stretched his body. His claws were spread out and had grown longer and more vicious. His wings spread to block the sun behind him, and he brought his claws down as he collided with the dragon. The copper scales of the thing flashed with light as he collided full body into Mash. The impact caused the clouds around them to disperse, leaving them an odd arena in the sky to fight in. The impact made Mash's bones creak, and he felt some of the scales on his chest break. The copper dragon didn't get away freely either. In the moment of impact, Mash pushed his claws down at the dragon's back. One arm tore through one of its coppery wings in the process. It crumpled like sheet metal as he pushed it into his back. The light seemed to ripple over his body from where Mash's claws struck at the dragon's back, and they failed to pierce any deeper. The shards of dirt and trees that chased the dragon, rammed into Mash's enormous form and shattered like glass against his own scales. Mash's claws didn't manage to dig into the dragon's hide, but they gave him a hold of the being. The impact had been less than 1,000 feet over the island. Mash began growing again as the copper drake opened his mouth. The creature's head was against Mash's chest. Mash could see the magic flow through the dragon's body and he tried to push the thing's head to the side at the last moment. A bar of blackness poured out of the dragon's mouth and split one of Mash's enormous wings in two. Mash barely even felt it, although neither of them could fly with only one wing, and they spiraled downward. Mash didn't hesitate and continued to strike at the other dragon as they fell. Mash's form had long limbs, and he swung crude fists. Some of the copper scales cracked as Mash's fist struck the dragon's neck. The other dragon's tail lashed forward, and Mash intercepted it with his own. The copper dragon's tail was like a sword though, and it clipped Mash's tail as if it were a weed. The copper dragon pushed Mash away with a surge of strength and light. Mash opened his mouth and filled the sky with blinding light. Lightning crashed into the copper drake in enormous wave power. Even it was not immune to the effect, and its body left a trail of smoke as they both crashed. Mash rose on unfamiliar limbs. It felt awkward. His body wasn't humanoid, and he didn't really have much practice in it. His arms were a little too long, and it took him a second to realize how he was supposed to stand. Priscilla had designed the body to be effective on all terrain, and that involved giving him a slightly more humanoid shape. If they had gone more draconic, then he probably wouldn't be able to move properly at all. Mash's movements brushed aside trees and shook the earth. His one wing opened and buried some trees under the dirt that it moved. His head easily peeked over the trees, and he searched for the other dragon. It had already risen to its feet, though it didn't attack immediately. "What are you?" The dragon's voice was deep, and Mash felt as though he was talking to a mountain. Wasn't this dragon supposed to be undead? How was it talking? The thought made him freeze up, and he hesitantly formulated a response. "I'm a chimera, I guess." "Who are you?" Chapter 359, Conversation Never Works. Mash waited for the dragon's response, unsure of what would come of the conversation. Luke hadn't expected this to happen and had basically told Mash to expect some mindless monsters. This seemed far closer to what Luke had done for Red before. "I am Torokan. You mean to say that you are here without knowing of me?" The dragon's voice sounded weirdly like churning rocks. Mash wondered if his translation item was helping him actually understand Torokan. "I heard of an undead dragon, but I didn't think you could talk. I was expecting mindless puppets." Mash made the comment without thinking much about it. Only after the words left his lips did he realize that they might be offensive. He belatedly tried to give them an abashed look, only to find it impossible in his new form. How did a dragon make an abashed expression? Mash continued to try and control his expression when he heard laughter. Torokan had no trouble with expression, and Mash could easily make out the mirth on the dragon's face. The scales around the dragon's eyes lifted slightly, as the corner of his mouth turned up. "You must be younger than you seem. Tell me why a chimera so young would encroach upon my domain." The dragon sounded surprisingly friendly for the damage they had done to one another. Mash's wing was slowly healing, and he could see the dragon doing the same. Torokan's wing uncrumpled as the bones within seemed to right themselves. For Mash, the two halves of his wing slowly reconnected. Strands of wood linked them together like roots or vines. They were both hurt, but not badly enough to ruin a chance at negotiation. Diplomacy with an undead dragon hadn't exactly been in the plan, but Mash felt like it could work. "This might be hard to believe, but I didn't actually come here for a fight. I just want to talk with the necromancer, I mean Valeria." The name didn't have the effect he wanted it to. Instead, both Torokan and the man on his shoulder glowered. Their eyes flared sharply with anger and hatred. Mash raised both hands in a warding gesture but turned into a far more dangerous motion with his body. The ground beneath him shook as he waved his arms back and forth, the air around them roared as if he were throwing trees around. Torokan snarled, his voice sounded more animalistic as it came out next. "You will not speak to her. Leave this place, we will not ask twice." Mash didn't respond immediately. With his domain, he noticed as two more people appeared beside the dragon. The air had torn open, and the two had stepped out of an otherworldly portal. It was vaguely similar to Mash's own portal skill. One of the people was an elf with silver-white hair that seemed to glitter in the air. The other was a beastman with black hair and fur, his ears were sharp and pointed, and they were flat against his head as he glared up at Mash. The elf oddly didn't seem to care about Mash. Mash looked over all of them. This was about how many people they had expected, and Priscilla told Jill and Luke that it was time for them to enter. He doubted he would be attracting any more attention than this. He opened his mouth to reply, but a hand of pure silvery light formed in an instant and pressed him into the ground. The hand was enormous, big enough to crush him completely. Mash spread his now healed wings and they caught the incoming hand. His body withstood the force, but he felt it. The conversation was over. He opened his mouth toward all of them. Magic mixed within his body. Fire, lightning, and water blended in a way that was unnatural and impossible. He released it an instant later. The fire was a deep shade of orange, and it flowed like water as it spread over the space like an enormous wave. It poured over the ground, scorching it black. Sparks of odd blue light danced over the whole thing, crackling loudly in the air as it approached the four. Torokin raised a hand and the ground rose up to stop the wave like a dam. Dirt and stone formed a crude wall. It failed. The moment his magic touched the half-formed wall, it didn't slow or stop. The dirt wall melted. At the same time, the magic crawled over the ground like an army of ants. That caught everyone off guard, even Mash. The wave of electrified fire rolled over them. The silvery hand above him dissipated as the elf was consumed by the flames. None of the people screamed in pain or reacted much to the attack. Mash himself just stared at his own magic for a second, before taking off into the skies. He had tested his combinations plenty and found that they could have a wide range of effects. Even mixing the same magic, in the same way, could result in something different. Both Priscilla and he believed it was an effect of his aspects. The less magic he combined, the lower the deviance. His lightning wood, for example, was fairly consistent, though he had experienced one odd deviation where he had made a tree that released sparks from its branches. Mash hovered in the air, his left arm aimed down toward them. Pillars of scorching air shot upward at him. The heat diminished as it approached him, but he still felt the air cascade over his body. Mash opened his palm. Green light flashed brightly as branches of lightning struck the ground beneath him. Rather than the roar of thunder, wood appeared replacing the lightning, cutting through anything that it could. They pierced the ground like a rain of 1,000 spears. Torokin's scales didn't get pierced, but strands of wood ran all over his body like vines. The other people didn't have the defenses of a dragon. The man who used the hot air had been pierced in one place by a thin strand of wood. Though the wound had already been burned shut and smoke trailed from the wood around him. The elf with silver hair had taken the brunt of the attack. He had been distracted by the fire and was unprepared for the follow-up. A thick shaft of wood had torn the elf's body apart, separating part of his shoulder and right arm from the rest of his body. The elf didn't seem to care, he very casually walked over to his severed arm. It took Mash a second to realize that the beastman wasn't there, and Mash couldn't find him with his domain. How? Mash couldn't worry about that. Much of the wood he made broke as Torokin leapt into the sky. The island seemed to give the dragon a push, and Torokin was fast. The air around the dragon. Mash started growing again, in an attempt to withstand the dragon. If nothing else, he would eventually overwhelm them with sheer size. Torokin slammed into him with such force that Mash's wings snapped as his body was pressed into them. They covered him like a loose cloak as Mash was pushed upward for a second. Some of the scales on Mash's chest cracked, and his bones crunched within. For an instant Mash struggled to breathe. Only for a moment though. One of the things this form granted him was a treant's ability to heal. His bones reconnected and his lungs mended almost immediately. His wings weren't a priority. Mash wasn't expecting Torokin to do so much damage so quickly, and it took him a moment to recover. With his domain, he was able to observe everything around him, so he noticed when a beastman appeared on his back. The beastman crawled out of the shadow that his wings had made as they pressed into his back. He plunged a tiny black metal dagger into Mash's back. Mash twirled in the air, flinging the beastman off his back and sending Torokin upward. The dagger remained in his back, and it began to burn. It felt like a fire was pouring out from the knife, and Mash tried to shape his body to remove it. His body didn't morph as he expected it to. His growth stopped and the reverse started. Mash shrunk rapidly, the knife left a black marking on his body that was growing rapidly to cover his entire form. His bones crunched and organs squished as his body was forcibly changed. Mash had to bite his lower lip to avoid vomiting. He shrunk as the dark writing expanded. Mash lost his scales and the wooden texture of his skin, and within a few moments, he returned to his semi-human form. The dagger is doing something, I will try to remove its effect. Priscilla's message was unneeded. He moved quickly, gripping and pulling out the black dagger. The dagger fell, but the black lines remained on his body. The beastman from earlier jumped from a shadow placed on him by Torokin above. The man seemed to be able to shift between shadows freely, and he was invisible to Mash when he did it. The beastman dove downward, a black blur in the otherwise clear sky. Even in this state, Mash wasn't weak. He spun in the air, swinging a fist around to smash into the beastman's head. A black furred palm caught his fist with a loud thud. The beastman grunted as he struggled to absorb the impact. You're a tough one, even without your transformation. Mash met the beastman's eyes and tried to understand what had happened to his body. It didn't feel normal. It didn't feel the same as he normally kept it. What did he look like? What in the depths are you? The beastman's eyes were wide with uncertainty as Mash met them with his own. Mash swung his hand down, throwing the beastman toward the ground. His gaze drifted to his own arm, which looked odd. His skin had a faint scale pattern to them, and a rainbow glow showed between them. Mash stared at his hand in stupefaction. The colors marking his skin reminded him of the past, back when he had first messed with his body. It was more subdued now, something that most people wouldn't be able to notice. He could see it though. It was almost as if his entire body was tattooed with a faintly glowing ink to make it look like he had scales. Mash licked at the inside of his mouth and felt like it was larger. His teeth were sharp, and he had 2 extra sets of smaller teeth behind the frontmost ones. It was an odd feeling. He blinked and felt 2 sets of eyelids close, one layer was weirdly transparent. Priscilla, what am I? Mash asked the question as he tried to understand his own body. He froze and realized that no new attack was coming. The 4 people he was fighting had paused as well. They stared at him, as he floundered to figure out what he was. Chapter 360, The Nature of Power. Mash wanted to see his reflection. To know what exactly he looked like. He wasn't sure how much he cared about his physical appearance, but it certainly provoked his curiosity. He felt weirdly good. The humanish form he had made with Priscilla was far stronger and faster than this, but this felt more normal. His magic flowed more freely, and his body felt more changeable for all that the black lines prevented him. Was this his body's natural state? He somehow felt like that was wrong. Based on the vague description given by Jill, he had been expecting something very different. He felt more in tune with his aspects too and almost wanted to utilize them. A silvery hand appeared in the air above him and swung downward like a fist. The elf was the first to make a move after the sudden transformation. Mash stood in the sky, his magic had solidified the air beneath his feet. It had been an unconscious gesture, that had come all too easily in this form. His gaze drifted to the silvery hand, and he imagined catching it. Not with his own hand, but with his aura and magic. He met the silver magic with its opposite. His aura infused with anti-magic met the hand and dispersed it. The silver light flashed and vanished, the only one truly aware of what had happened was him. Invisible arrows of heat flew across his domain and turned into gentle gusts of warm air as they struck his skin. He looked over the group of 4 and realized something. His forms were limited in a way. They had improved some of his magical and physical abilities, but they weakened his connection with his skills. He had changed his very nature without ever noticing it. He had countered the change to chase after the strength he had perceived. He smiled faintly, as he blocked more of the elf's magic. The forms had their place, but he didn't have to rely on them. Torokin fell from the sky like a boulder. Mash jumped, kicking off the solidified air in a thunderous leap. He used wind magic to move even faster. Even with his domain and speed, he barely avoided the enormous dragon. Weak magic will not work within its domain. Torokin's shout seemed to resonate with the island. The trees and waters shook with each word. The black-furred beastman leapt into the air like an arrow. A dagger of red metal flashed in his hands as he closed the distance. They fought the chimera of the end and the beginning, and he has yet to show them the other half of his nature. Mash felt a connection to his magic. All of his magic. He felt each of the hundreds of strands of wood that littered the ground from his lightning. The sparking lake of fire that remained for his earlier combination. He felt connected to them. He reached out to the flames and pulled on them. They rose from the ground, shooting upward like a storm of insects and intercepting the beastman. The two collided, and the beastman pushed through the flame, his fur burned and his skin charred, but he ignored it. Then the flames changed, and a three-fingered hand of sparking, the flowing fire caught the beastman's leg and flung him to the ground. The flames coalesced, forming three artificial life forms. Mash could not control the life he made, but he didn't have to impart genuine life to create a puppet. He made a hollow creation, with an empty soul that would do nothing but respond to his magic. In a way, it was like an advanced golem. The only difference was that he could construct them with any of his magic. Torokin swung an enormous hand through two of the still-forming life forms, dispersing their bodies. It did no real damage to them as they reformed into vaguely humanoid things. They were odd headless creatures, with pointed tips for legs and three-edged fingers. Their bodies constantly moved and undulated like both fire and water. Mash looked over the four of them, resting his eyes on the beastman who was getting back to his feet. The beastman's wounds hadn't healed, but they didn't seem to bother the man. "Thanks. I figured something out." Mash spoke slowly, his hand rose to point toward the man. His palm was open. All these people were within his domain. His space, his body. Mash had been thinking about his power all wrong. Wood and lightning magic mixed again, but this time it happened directly beside the beastman. The beastman tried to dodge, tried to disappear into the shadows as he had before, but this time Mash was watching him. Mash blocked the man as he attempted to disappear into his shadow. An instant later lightning pierced through the man, tearing through his legs in a violent burst of light. Wood appeared in its place, replacing the lightning with a misshapen creation of wood. Mash had tried to activate the magic within the man's legs but hadn't been able to. Torokin roared and opened his mouth. Mash turned, raising his arm to block the magic. Red light ran from the dragon's chest up into his mouth. A bar of blackness escaped, cutting through the sky in an instant. Mash's outstretched arm met the black sand, as he failed to stop the magic. His hand disappeared. His arm up to his elbow had just vanished, completely destroyed by the moving sand. Pain ran up his arm a moment later as if his body couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. Another arrow of heat sped toward him. Mash attempted to block it as he had done before. This time the arrow was so hot it seemed to scorch the very air it passed through. Mash failed to stop it too, and the arrow tore directly through his shoulder. It was only the size of his palm, but it burned through him. It melted his flesh and cauterized it at the same time. The impact sent him spiraling slightly. The wind raced in his ears. This time the pain came much more quickly. Mash gasped as he dodged out of the way of the next arrow. It seemed like they weren't holding back anymore. The black lines on Mash's body were evaporating. He could see it dissolving from his flesh and knew that Priscilla would break the effects soon. She was busy with that, so he had to heal his own injuries. Mash's missing hand wasn't as serious as the shoulder wound. He didn't have a great way to heal, but he did by altering his own body. In this form, he found it surprisingly easy to do just that. The wound on his shoulder closed, and the flesh there grew back together. Mash watched all of them with his domain and dove out of the way of several more attacks. Bars of silvery light and invisible arrows streaked across the sky. He switched his focus to dodging and healing. The longer the fight went, the stronger he would become, and they would get weaker too. He could see their mana and stamina bleed from them just for being within his domain. Mash spun in the air, dodging as another black stream of sand cut through the air. It was a narrow dodge, and he heard the air whoosh past his ears. The sand tapered off and began to fall like snow. Torokin closed the distance using the breath attack as a cover. The dragon moved agilely despite his size. When he got close, the dragon drew his wings together and rolled over his head. His tail snapped like a whip. The whole movement was smooth and practiced. Mash was about to dodge, but the beastman from earlier had appeared from a shadow created by a silvery hand to shove him backward. Mash stumbled a little in the air, which was enough time for Torokin to hit. Mash raised his arms to block the tail, though he doubted he could. The dragon's tail met Mash's guard, and the sound of the impact rang across the sky. It sounded like two boulders colliding. Mash's arms broke, and the tail pushed through his guard, striking him in the chest with enough force to cave it in. The resounding cracking sound was worse than thunder, and Mash was hurled toward the ground like a comet. Mash's breath left him, and his arms hung limply as he fell. Even if he could move his arms, he would have struggled to do anything from how the air pressed against his body. With broken arms and ribs, he had nothing to use but magic. Mash mixed water and wind, manipulating the air beneath him. He imagined a cloud catching him and formed it on the island's surface. His magic bubbled from the ground. A white foam that seemed oddly like soap bubbles surged from between the trees. They grew almost as fast as he fell, and they caught him maybe 100 feet from the ground. The cloud of suds was surprisingly dense, and it felt like he had slammed into a bed of thick honey. It hurt more than he expected, but it was enough to stop most of the damage. Mash tried to land on his feet, but the bubbles slowed him enough to control his landing. He still rolled forward with the impact, tumbling through the weird clouds a little. When he stood, he began healing. The final strands of black lines vanished from his body. I will heal you and take over the puppets. Mash passed over control of the 3 fire things he had made and forgotten about. He pushed himself to stand as Priscilla managed the worst of his wounds. The effect of the knife was gone now, and she was able to heal most of his wounds easily. His missing hand regrew, first in the form of wood, and then replaced with skin and bone like normal. The clouds hid him from the others, but they were still visible to him. Mash saw as the beastman attempted to stab him again with that black knife. Mash turned and caught the beastman's arm on his own. Mash's stats finally reached the point where he could intercept the assassin. Mash pulled on the beastman's arm while kicking him in the chest. The beastman's arm ripped from his body as the man flew through the bubbles. Black blood sprayed outward as Mash swung the arm around and threw it into the bubbles. Mash let the bubbles expand further, and let them cover the island. It's not like they could blind him. Plus, they wouldn't really damage the island, and they did wonders at hiding him. Arrows of heat caused bursts of steam throughout the cloud, but none of them struck Mash. You haven't gained as much power as expected. One of them likely has the skill to lower your stats over the course of a battle. Mash could feel what she meant. He should be a lot stronger. Even if the whole fight had only lasted a few minutes, he had starved himself prior to the fight and should be a lot stronger than before. Yeah, I noticed. It's fine, I'm weakening them too. The net change might still be around what he hoped, though he wouldn't risk the assumption. Just treat them as if they were just as strong as they were at the start of the fight. The difference was in him alone. He had grown stronger.